All right, I think we will go ahead and get started. Welcome. My name is David Gottfried. I'm the director of the National Nanotechnology Coordinated Infrastructure, the Coordinating Office. Welcome to another one of our NNCI webinars, this time focusing on societal and ethical implications of nanotechnology. I'm going to hand it off to my colleague Jamie Wetmore in a moment, but I just want to remind everybody all of the NNCI events, webinars, and in-person events can be found on the NNCI website. That's at nnci.net. And you can also find past recordings of past webinars, which you can also find on our YouTube channel, which you can get to by just Googling NNCI and YouTube, and that should be the first option that comes up. As a reminder, at the end of today's webinar, there will be an opportunity for the audience to ask questions. And so use the Q&A function of Zoom at the bottom of the screen rather than the chat function. And with that, I will say thank you and turn it over to Jamie Wetmore to proceed.
Thanks, David. So we try to do these societal and ethical implication webinars at least once a year. And as I was thinking, what could we do this year? I said, well, what are people talking about more than anything else? And also, what are people not talking about more than anything else? And I think that's the current state of science policy in the United States, at least when it comes to interface with nanotechnology these days. And we're very, very lucky to have Debbie Stine joining us today. Debbie Stine was there she shook my hand on my first day of my journey into science policy. She ran the fellowship program at the National Academy of Sciences, now called the Mazayan Program. And I was in the first cohort, and I was a brand new young PhD student, had no idea what I was doing, and she carefully guided me. And here we are all these years later, Debbie, still hanging out. So I'm going to give you a little bio of Debbie, just so you know her bona fides and where she's coming from. But she is currently and is the founder of the Science and Technology Policy Academy. But she has a long history of prior to that. She served as the Obama White House, in the Obama White House as executive director of the President's Council on Advisors on Science and Technology. She was at the Congressional Research Service for a while. She was a study director at the National Academies for a long time. And she's even been a professor, put that hat on as well, at Carnegie Mellon University. If you enjoy today's talk and you want to know more about science and technology policy, this is your Bible. This just came out a year ago. Is that right, Debbie?
That's right. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jamie, for promoting it. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm looking at it right next to yours on your screen as well. But it is absolutely a great crash course into figuring out what is this thing called science and technology policy, and how might I get involved, and what are some of the basic skills I might need to start ramping up. So, so thank you very much, Debbie, for joining us. And I will jump into questions. We're going to try to go something like 40 minutes. But if you're anxious and you want to ask a question beforehand, as David said, go ahead and put it in the Q&A. But I'm going to start, Debbie. Where are we? We've had 100 days of the Trump administration. So many things seem to have changed in that time. Can you give us a quick rundown of what's happened and where we're at?
Well, this is definitely, I would say, the most challenging times that the world of science technology policy has faced, probably almost since the nation began. I did a lot of work when I worked for the Congressional Research Service. I did a lot about the history of science technology policy in the United States. And even from those early days, it was very clear that the founding fathers, like Thomas Jefferson, for example, saw that science, technology, and innovation was going to play a role. It's even, in the Constitution, a provision that accounts for patents and things like that. Some of the very first offices that were set up, or what's today's NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, but that in those days were just standards and measures and all sorts of different things. And all of it was related to commerce, right? Those are the first science agencies in the United States. So now we're over 200 years later, and you can see it all sort of crashing down around us for every single agency that's occurring. So let's just kind of take one element of it. So the first thing that has occurred is that we've had literally thousands and thousands of federal workers who have STEM backgrounds, who are working for STEM agencies, who have lost their jobs. And as a result, they cannot provide those services. And it's in everything that you can possibly imagine. What you'll hear about primarily are the ones that are in the agencies that focus on research funding, because that's the way kind of universities think. And so that is the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health. But you'll see it all over the place as well. For example, like they're looking at closing down the EPA Office of Research and Development. I just heard today that there were about 100 plus people cut at the National Renewable Energy Lab in Colorado. And no matter what part of science technology policy you care about, that federal workforce is greatly diminished, and we're definitely going to lose, I would say, 2 generations. So the first generation, I would say, are the elders like myself, who've been around for a long time, who have all these decades of knowledge. And for those people, they're just going to retire, move on to something else. And then we're also going to lose, I think, this new generation, the ones that are coming in. So, like I worked with somebody, I do a lot of consulting work in West Virginia. I worked with somebody who got her PhD. She works in forestry in West Virginia. She moved with her family to California to work for the Department of Interior and Environmental Justice. She hadn't been in the job for more like 2 weeks, and she lost her job as a probationary employee. So that's sort of like one element of it. The second part is the research funding. So there's right now, NSF has basically stopped making grants. They rescinded funding. In other words, funding that was already made it through the peer review system for 1,000 grants. And you're also seeing the same thing happen at NIH. And right now, the last I heard as of last week was that NSF was not really taking in proposals, reviewing proposals, doing all those things that we sort of take for granted. They have closed down pretty much all their advisory committees that provided advice for this. And at the agencies for NIH, NSF, DOE, there's something called F&A. Those are the administrative costs that are part of how research is paid for. And those, they were negotiated with the Office of Naval Research at usually somewhere around 30 to 40 sort of percent. It varied by institution. They're all now down to like a flat 15%. So researchers who are at what we call soft money, in other words, they are not paid by the university, they're paid through research grants at nonprofits as well, who are funded by those. Those people are also like losing their jobs. So we have a lot happening in the workforce at all areas, wherever you're employed, whether you're at a university, a nonprofit, or the federal government. Is like sort of one big element. Then, of course, you have research that has stopped. So this is things that are like, say, clinical trials. So you might be in the middle of a cancer clinical trial, and all of a sudden now there's no funding for it that's available, and the clinical trial has to stop. It's not considered to be ethical, but that is also occurring. You have experiments that have been maybe going on for like 5 years, I've seen, like it's a 5-year grant, say for a young investigator, early career investigator at NSF, and they've lost their funding at year 3. So they might have collected all the data, but they don't have any ability to analyze it. So we're also losing a lot of research on important topics to the nation as well. And then on the international front, we're also facing a lot of challenges. So one of the first agencies to be hit was at the U.S. Agency for International Development, which did a lot of work related to disease and environment and energy. And now we're seeing it spread throughout. So like trying to close a Fogarty International Center at NIH. We've seen a lot of threats to international students, enough so that the ones who are here are having a challenging time staying, particularly the ones who are like maybe here and they have what's called OPT, where they can get practice training for a couple of years, but they still have to have support. And of course, it's going to be really challenging for new international students to come in. So we're pretty much being hit on all fronts. And it basically, in the end, is that since World War II, FDR wrote a letter to Vannevar Bush, who was head of the version of what is today's White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, said, okay, well, what is it? What's it? You guys have done a great job in the war. Like before World War II, the federal government didn't have much of a role in research. It was primarily universities and philanthropy and private individuals. After World War II, there was a compact that the federal government, in exchange for all the services and the benefits provided to the nation, which has been well documented by universities and research, that the federal government, on behalf of the American people, would fund this research. That has clearly been stopped. And we're likely to see even more challenges as we face the upcoming budget season. So it's definitely a challenging time. Like I said, the most challenging I think we've ever faced for science and technology policy.
Yeah, thank you for that. That is
Sorry, doomsday, but
that was a
I
very,
mean,
very quick distillation.
yeah.
Do you want to say something about science for policy?
Mhm.
Do we know how scientific research and data is being used in policy decision makings these days?
Well, just sort of as background, the way I look at it is being an engineer by trade, I like to talk about policy for science and technology and science technology for policy. So, for example, the National Nanotech Initiative is an example of policy for science and technology. So there was a decision that was made decades ago, I think at this point, it's been a long time, that there was like concerns about nanotechnology. And so therefore there should be a centralized interagency program called the National Nanotechnology Initiative that would bring together all the different agencies and focus on this topic. So that's an example of policy for science technology. Now, science and technology for policy is how that information, how research is used to respond to societal needs. So, for example, like, uh, what can we do for, say, nanotechnology that will help in manufacturing, right? And what are the policies that can support nanotechnology so that it gets to that marketplace? Another example I like to use is climate change. So policy for science and technology would talk about like, well, should we fund climate change research? What should be the priorities? Who should do it? Where should it focus? While science and technology for policy will say, okay, based on what we know, we've learned from scientists, engineers, what should we do about, say, carbon dioxide reduction? Um, uh, what do we have to be worried about, when it comes to flooding and related to climate change, and what's the best action to take based on scientific technical evidence to climate change? So what we're seeing now is that in terms of like right now it's in the Trump administration, it's sort of a mix. So we definitely have, in terms of the policy for science and technology, it's all these sort of devastating cuts that we have seen in terms of staffing and research funding, both for research conducted by the federal government and supported by the federal government. But we're also starting to see that impact of where it's science and technology for policy, where it's going to be increasingly difficult to make decisions because the federal staff at, say, NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, they are shutting down parts of of their work. And so what that means is, like a lot of people, there's like sort of a famous story that a member of Congress said, why do I need to have the National Weather Service? I can just turn on my news and it'll tell me what the weather is. But what people didn't realize, or this member of Congress in this story, is that that data comes from someplace. And so a lot of the data that we see, a lot of the analysis that we see, is just not going to be there anymore.
So lots and lots of changes. How is the S&T policy community responding?
Well, I would say in general, it's been a mixed bag. So one of my primary concerns is that we have seen some major science technology organizations, including the National Academy of Sciences for Engineering and Medicine, which had the Resign program where I used to work. I worked there for 18 years. They have taken preemptive action. So for example, because of concerns about DEI programs, rather than waiting to see what the Trump administration would do, they went ahead and closed down a program. As opposed to say, and I would say HHMI, the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, also did something similar. We've also seen universities also do things like in the early days sort of close these DEI programs. Even before anybody told them that they had to do it, just because they said, okay, well, they might come after us. So that was sort of very concerning. And I think like I've also been concerned that, say, major organizations like AAAS, American Association for the Advancement of Science, the university associations like the Association for American Universities, the Association of Land Grant Universities, they have pretty much focused what I would say only on themselves. Like they didn't really come to life until the decision came down for these F&A costs. And all of a sudden, when it was on their financial bottom line, then you started to see some action by them. But it's been very slow. Now, I realize it's only been 100 days, but I think in my personal opinion, at least, they acted pretty quickly as soon as that F&A decision was made, and they did not act at all when it came to federal workers and federal STEM workers. And so what that kind of showed me is that the science technology community tends to really focus only on the research aspect of the community, and the sort of the academic aspect of it, and not to me the broader world. To me, that is the world of science and technology for policy. That they really only want to focus on policy for science technology, give us more research money, right? But in my mind, they don't make a very good case for themselves when they do that, because the reason that we have this compact is because of the benefits that scientific research provides society. And those benefits don't show up at the research stage most of the time. They show up later in the implementation of that research, the implementation of policy. Now, on the good news front, and I should say I have a newsletter, by the way, for anybody who's interested. If you connect with me on LinkedIn, you'll see I have two newsletters. One is a newsletter about science, technology, policy job openings. We have about 100 or so every week. The other one is like an opinion newsletter, which is based after my book. Is called From Expertise to Impact. And so as part of that, I try to give a shout out to all the organizations out there who are doing things. And we have increasingly seen over the past couple of weeks, some organizations taking the lead. The first one of these was one of the organizations that probably has the most resources of anybody, and that was Harvard, right? We saw Harvard saying, hey, you can't come through, and it's freedom of expression. You shouldn't shut down our research. Without, if you look at the grants where rescinding has been withdrawn, you'll see that if you look at the National Science Foundation website, they will say, well, this research funding was rescinded because it is no longer with agency priorities, right? And they said, and there's no right of appeal. But according to the rules, there is a right of appeal, right? And so what that means is you need to have legal action. And so we're finally starting to see some of these societies becoming part of this legal action. The very first one that I remember, at least, was the Association of Public Health, APHA. They started to do an action. And just last week, some other organizations, scientific and technical organizations, joined them in that lawsuit. So what the mantra that I have been sort of focusing on is actually comes from the New York Times editorial board, which has sort of like three things that they have been saying, which is the first thing is sort of almost basically like acknowledging there's a problem, which I think for a while the S&T community says, oh, this will pass, but then it got worse and worse and worse, and so you're sort of finally sort of saying that. The second thing is the need to take legal action, and so now this is very clear that the method of the Trump administration is to not worry about the degree to which actions are legal, but instead take the actions and then have the legal action and just sort of see how much will kind of stick post-legal action. And then the third aspect of it is unity. And that is where the science technology community has a challenge, and that there is not, at this point, there's no one organization out there who represents all the science and technology community. And I don't think it was apparent until now that there is no such organization. I think people maybe thought it'd be AAAS, but it definitely is not, even though they have definitely done some sympathy kinds of things. Oh yeah, so sorry about the federal workers. It's like one line or two lines. They haven't taken any action in a substantive way, other than saying that there's a problem. But they're not like been doing things that are in my mind, at least substantive actions. So that I think is and this is sort of what I wrote about last week, is we need somebody to take the lead. And right now we don't have any leaders.
We have groups that could be leaders, but they've chosen not to lead, is what you're
Right.
saying.
There's groups that there definitely are organizations that could be leaders.
Yeah.
And view this as a fundamental battle for scientific freedom, and but it will take legal action, and they have to be really willing to take that legal action. It's nothing that can be, no matter how much publicity we do, it would make sense. And we also have to be realistic that when like one of the letters that was, I thought, there was about, I think, over 1,000 members of the members, not the National Academy of Sciences itself, but the members of the National Academies of Science, Engineering, Medicine wrote their own letter, because I think the academies would not write a letter. But to me, it was still weak, because they talked about the problem, but in the end, they said it's the public that should fight for us. And so the question, or you'll see the companies, the corporations, that use the research should fight for us. But if the research community, or I should say the scientific technology community, is not willing to fight for itself, why should these other organizations take the risk? And that is really sort of the fundamental issue. Why should, like, a pharma company say, hey, I'm going to do this? And then for the American people, why should they fight for science and technology when they're worried about their Social Security offices being closed, right? They're worried now with tariffs, how we're going to pay the bills, how we're going to sell our products in our little stores, right? So they have bigger, what they call kitchen table issues to worry about than science and technology. And so to me, it seems somewhat arrogant of us to expect the public to save us, when our leaders should be really focusing on saving us. In general, the organizations I have been pointing people to are the Union of Concerned Scientists and the Federation of American Scientists. The other one is AAUP, which is the American Association of University Professors. So those three organizations are the ones that I have sort of seen pretty much in the lead. But the thing is that other than AAUP, the one with university professors, most of them don't have like jurisdiction for like legal action. And I think that's something important. But so therefore, to take legal action, you have to be representing constituency. So that means it's really on the scientific societies, the university associations to do these things. And like I said, it's not that they're doing little legal action, but the legal action I've seen is all on this financial front, where it's like on the F&A cost, which is of course important, but that's not the big picture issues.
Right. Universities can do all the science in the world, but if nobody listens to them and puts anything into action, then you don't get the benefits.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's just, it's a very focused world. And I think the other thing, which is a complicating factor, is that if you look at the data in terms of trust in American universities, it has been declining for some time. Like for all institutions, it's been declining, but for American universities, it's been declining. And even if you like talk to members of Congress and things like that, because of the high tuition cost, there's a lot less confidence in universities as institutions. And instead, they are viewed more as caring more about money than anything else. And so therefore, these legal actions don't help in that regard either, right? Because basically the universities are saying, are giving, hey, we don't care about the people who got laid off, even at our own universities, due to these, changes in federal funding. Instead, we care about the F&A, which is what pays for, like the conduct of that research, which pays the institution back for that research.
Right.
Again, I'm not saying that F&A is not important, but I think it misses the big picture.
All right, Debbie, so we've talked about 100 days. We've got, what, almost 200 days left before the end of the year. I'm going to ask you to be Nostradamus. Do you have any insights into what might be next? What are we looking forward to in the next, the rest of this year?
Well, the big issue that's coming up is the federal budget. So last week, they released what's called the skinny budget, which is a budget proposal for all the federal agencies that came out of the sort of the Trump administration. And those proposed really devastating cuts, like say 50%-ish at NSF, NIH, NOAA, pretty much all the different agencies that conduct science. So that's just the president's budget, though. The next step is to go to Congress. Now, the president's approval rating is low. It's the lowest it has been since they started like looking at like 100-day sort of popularity rating. But you know who's even lower? It's the Democrats. And like you'll see that the president is around 37 something percent. The Democrats, I think, are about like 30 something percent. And then Congress, which I think is even lower than both of those. So there's been a lot of concern that congressional Democrats have not taken action, that the only two who are really, well, I guess two that are really visible out there are AOC and Bernie Sanders. Even Cory Booker, who did this long speech and so forth, he sort of did something. But right now, it appears Congress, and by that I mean both the Democrats and the Republicans, have sort of abdicated their responsibility, because a lot of what President Trump is doing is actions that were authorized and appropriated by Congress. So the question is, now that this budget goes to Congress, that's the next step, right? That was what was submitted last week. What will happen in Congress? Because if President Trump does get enough pushback, sometimes things happen, like they're going to close local Social Security offices. Enough members of Congress pushed back that they did stop at least some of those closures. On tariffs, remember there was that big day, what was that called? Independence Day or something? I can't remember. But now we have a hold on tariffs. They're just thinking about them now because there were actual Republican members of Congress who said this is a bad idea. This is going to really hurt the economy. Now, the challenge is that, President Trump never says that something is a bad idea or that all his ideas are sort of great ideas, is that it's in this case, it's created sufficient uncertainty in the market that nobody is willing to make an investment in the business community. So when we're looking out for what's happening between now and the end of the year, what you really want to watch is what's happening with that budget. And that budget affects both policy for science technology and science technology for program. What budget, what programs are included, what programs are excluded and basically totally defunded. Those are all going to be part of those budget discussions, and you want to see what Congress does. Now, for Congress, you have two kinds of committees. You have authorization committees like the House Science Committee that say, hey, NSF should exist, and this is what program should be part of NSF. But that's not really where the power comes from. The power comes from the appropriations committees. There's 12 appropriations committees. They're named the same in the House and in the Senate. And it's those committees where sort of the rubber meets the road. And we're going to see in the end how much funding goes to all these different programs. There's been many times that Congress has saved a program that the president has proposed be defunded. One example that has been a constant issue over the years is the EPSCoR program, which is meant to help agencies, meant to help states that, who don't have all the money. So not like where I am, which is in Pennsylvania, not Massachusetts, not California, but places that I do consulting in, like West Virginia, South Carolina, the places that don't have much research funding. So Congress in the past has saved this program any number of times over the decades that I have been watching it. Right now, there's a lot of rural programs that have been cut from USDA that the President Trump is trying to end. Well, again, a lot of people, Republicans, represent those rural areas. And the question is, will they care enough about those programs to bring them back to life? For tariffs, right now farmers have a hard time selling their crops overseas because of this concern about tariffs. So that's what we really want to watch between now and so the rest of the year. Officially, the budget decision, that the federal fiscal year ends on September 30th. The Congress is supposed to decide before September 30th what the budget will be. That has literally not happened for 20 some years, that they have passed the budget on time. And in fact, even this year, they just did a continuing resolution, which is basically keeping basically the same budget, which was actually Biden administration budget. So, so you have kind of the issues like that. There's a lot of infighting among the Republican Party. There's a really good article in the Washington Post, I think yesterday or the day before, which is kind of like 6 lines some Republicans will not cross, right? So there's Republicans who are really passionate about the deficit, and other kinds of issues. So we'll see if Congress actually finds its voice, and this is for both Democrats and Republicans. So the main kind of bright spot in the horizon is after 2025, and that's when we go into the next year, and that is the midterm election. So it is not uncommon for a second-term president to lose the midterm election in the second year of their 4-year presidency. It's pretty common for both Democrats and Republicans. And if that occurs, if everything switches, if the control of the Senate and control of the House, which is in both cases by a very, very small margin, just a handful of people, then that will hopefully kind of stop some of the deluge of challenges that we're facing. So that's kind of like the only bright hope that we have for things to turn around. But it really is kind of like, we're kind of in a 2-year season of which we are now just 100 days in to those like 600 something days. And those, I think, are the big things to watch out for.
Thank you, Debbie. I'm going to ask one more question before I open it up to the audience. I take students to Washington, D.C. every summer, and faculty as well. And I think a number of them that are coming with me this year are in this room right now. One of the first lessons I always give them traditionally prior to this year has been that even though it looks like there are certain parties that don't like science as much as other parties, there has been a long, strong bipartisan commitment to science and technology R&D in the United States for a wide variety of reasons, but especially economic reasons. And we saw that even in the first Trump administration. We are seeing the opposite of that now. Do you have any explanation for why this change has happened, where one party has decided, or at least one person has decided, to do as much as they can to stifle scientific and engineering research and development?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there's a couple of things going on. So the first question is, like, why is President Trump doing this in the first place, right? Because, during the first Trump administration, he basically did not pay any attention to science and technology for quite a while. In fact, he didn't even have a science advisor or President's Council advisor on science technology till like year 3 of his 4-year term, right? What changed in those 4 years and what has led to what's occurring today are two things that occurred. The first is interacting with scientists because during the pandemic. And that turned him sort of very negative, on scientists who would tell him, who would, as they say, bring truth to power and say, no, you can't do certain things, right? The second thing that happened is Sharpie Gate, which I don't know if you remember that, but Sharpie Gate occurred when the president was in the Oval Office and he said a hurricane was not going the way that the people at NOAA said it was going, but going another direction, right? And so sort of the feeling, is that is why some of this is occurring. Is it sort of like, don't ask the questions if you don't want to know the answers. And that is why he's not funding a lot of this activity. And some of it is some of it is social issues like in DEI and things like that. But a lot of it is just that fundamental, sort of issue. So I worked in my 30 some years in DC, I worked with many great Republicans and Democrats, on it. So it's always over the decades been very bipartisan. I worked on something a report called Rising Above the Gathering Storm that led to the America Competes Act. And that report was requested by bicameral, meaning both the House and Senate, both the Democrats and Republicans. The Republicans came from Tennessee. They came from New Mexico. Why? Because there are big national labs there and a lot of jobs that are in those states. And one of the people that I worked with the most was Senator Lamar Alexander, who's a Republican from Tennessee, who has since left. And he told me something, which is always, Debbie, it's not the party, it's the people, right? And that is, I think, the most fundamental thing to keep in mind. Do not make assumptions about a member of Congress's, or any policy leader for that matter, position based on their party. There are plenty of Republicans who think action should be taken on climate change. There are plenty of Republicans who support science and technology and believe it's important. There are plenty who care about healthcare research and who care about quantum research and who care about all these different things. So don't make the assumption that just because they're Republican, that they don't care about science and technology. It's really, really important when you meet with any member of Congress to look at their website, look at like who is in their district. Do they have a university in their district, which is big employees? The biggest employer in Pennsylvania, where I'm at, is the universities, the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, which is like where I'm based at in Pittsburgh, right? So they are big employers, and what happens to them affects the entire state. The other thing to look at is their position. So look at what issues that they care about, and you'll find that, they might quite well care about like national parks and resources. Maybe they're not, they care about clean water, they care about clean air, they care about a lot of these different things. And they do this because they care and because their constituents care. Now, how you achieve those goals sometimes will vary, but in terms of the actual goals that they have, they often do not differ that much among parties. So the most important thing is to don't go in there presuming anything about a member of Congress. And I would say that the thing that I've most often seen when I worked on Capitol Hill is that somebody would come in, they had done no research at all on the person whom they are, who they're meeting, and they propose something, and the member of Congress says, "Oh, I introduced a bill on that last week." They hadn't done their research. Or, they're, talking to somebody, they're talking down to that person, like, "Oh, I'm the great person coming from on high, telling you something you did not know. Please, receive my knowledge," right? So when I'm teaching, like in my book, and you'll see this, what I generally find is that thank you, and I appreciate you having a physical copy there, Jamie, is that, and by the way, it's only $10 on Amazon. I kept it as cheap as I could. Is that when you have to look, when you're talking about policy, that you have the 4 E's, okay? And most researchers only focus on the first E, which is effectiveness. And effectiveness is not enough for policymaking. Just like if you're buying a car, you care a lot more about things other than it will get you from point A to point B, right? So you care about efficiency. That's the second E. And that's what's going to get you the most bang for the subtle buck. A lot of researchers take no interest, do nothing to think about how much a policy costs. They can propose something that costs as much as the entire budget of that agency, and they wouldn't know, right? Because they don't think about how much it costs. And just like when we buy a car, like sometimes we can only afford a little car, sometimes we can afford a bigger car. Yeah. The third E is equity. And with equity, that is, who are the winners, who are the losers? What is the fairness of the policy? So sometimes, we're going to buy, we really care about the environment. Maybe we'll buy a hybrid car or something like that. But other times we have to take other things in factor, like, I have 6 kids, they can't fit in this little hybrid, right? And then the last E is ease of political acceptability. And by that, I don't mean politics, but what I mean is the degree to which people will support or oppose a policy. It's very hard to get on the agenda of a policymaker. And the degree to which you're likely to get on their agenda is the degree to which people, their constituents, not you, but their constituents, care about that policy. And also, if people oppose things, it also makes a difference. Like one of the things I'm working on right now is looking at data centers in West Virginia. And you have the leadership of West Virginia, the governor and the legislature, who's saying, "Hey, we should bring data centers in West Virginia." But we have communities who are saying, "Hey, that data center is only going to bring us 8 jobs, and it's going to use up all our water, clean water, and we already don't have enough water to serve our community needs," right? And it's that level of opposition that sort of makes a difference. So keep in mind those 4 E's: effectiveness, efficiency, equity, and ease of acceptability, and make sure you know the answers of that before talking to a policymaker.
Thank you, Debbie. A number of us are going to be going to talking to policymakers very soon, so that's great advice. We have some questions from the audience. We have Kara Grieger, who's asking about collective action. You've sort of hinted at that we do need some sort of collective action. I don't know that you have the social science background and a huge background in collective action research. But do you have any tips or hints or of how that could actually be mobilized? And
yeah, so well, let me put it this way. This is the way I look at it, this is a literature question. Okay, literature rarely answers real world questions. Okay, so that's take. But the way I look at it, it is sort of a political science question. However, I think what is most important is by collective action. I have, my belief, and this has been for a while, even before the Trump presidency, is that the people of the science technology community, by that I mean the scientists, engineers, and the health professionals, they really need to be part of unions. So we found even before this, like I remember when I was at the AAAS annual meeting, like last year, I think it was, there was a whole panel discussion on collective action, like unions for graduate students and postdocs to fight for their rights with universities. Some, faculty, also are people who I think should start to begin to belong to unions. And right now, what we're seeing is at the National Science Foundation, that they have a union, which is part of the AFL-CIO. Not all the, not all the members of NSF staff were part of a union, but now many of them are. And so there is a strong group at the NSF of staff who are now part of this union. They're planning to do something in a few weeks for the 75th anniversary of NSF. And they're sort of discovering the power of collective action. So I think the concept of collective action, Kara, is good. I just think that the answers are more likely to come from real world lessons, like what has been effective. I did a study like postdocs, for example, where many of them were not getting sort of any sort of benefits, healthcare, things like that. It was a study I did when I was at the National Academies. University of California at that point listened. They changed their policies so that all the postdocs started to get benefits, right? There's still issues related to pay, but it's also better now than it was back then. All those kinds of rights. So, like I think as Emma Rose here, I see here the next one. Yes, I think unions are really the best way, because the thing with unions is they represent people. So part of the challenge, as I said, is a union of concerned scientists, even though it has union in the title, does not represent anybody. You don't even become a member of the Union of Concerned Scientists. I asked about this because for both of them, the Union of Concerned Scientists and the Federation of American Scientists, I said, okay, I'm going to finally belong to these organizations. And I found out you can't become a member. It turns out that you just provide a donation to them and they do collective action, but they don't represent you. So that means the Union of Concerned Scientists doesn't have the ability to take, as best I understand, I guess I'm not a lawyer, to say take action on behalf of the federal workers, because they don't represent federal workers. So when it comes to legal actions, it's really important.
All right, we have a question from Bill Wilson. I will say that personally, I've been waiting for my university to stand up and do something, and I will follow them. And that doesn't appear to be happening. And I think that's well, Bill's university is standing up and doing something. Bill hails from Harvard, so they are standing up and doing something. But Bill's curious, is anyone actually just organizing the PIs who've had grants terminated to create a class action suit?
So the answer to that is, I've been worried about this, but I just found out that yes, there is an effort to begin to organize people who've had their grants terminated. So if you go to my newsletter, again, the one that just happened like this past week, and we can maybe put a link in the chat. You'll see that at the bottom of that, I herald like all these organizations. So there are some folks who are doing it. It is the Association of American University Professors. That seems to be the organization who is willing to do lawsuits. There are chapters, I've never belonged to this organization. I don't know very much about them, but initially at Harvard, it was the Harvard chapter of the AAUP that was fighting for this, academic freedom. And so I think that is where the collective action is going to appear. So, I encourage you to look again, go to connect with me on LinkedIn, and then you'll see that newsletter. You'll find the details on that. But I was trying to figure that out for quite a while, because I was asking on LinkedIn is where I'm very active. I was asking on LinkedIn, I wasn't hearing anything, and I finally heard something like right at the end of last week.
Debbie, we just posted one of your newsletters. Is that the one? This is the
Let me see.
Inform and Influence S&T Policy.
Right, exactly. Yes, exactly. So I'm going to this one. Yeah, so if you go, you go to that link and then go to the one where it says, the first newsletter below that, where it says United, we stand, divided we fall. So I went back to a Patrick Henry quote. If you click on that newsletter, and if you go all the way to the bottom, let me see here. Let me see, it's AU. Yeah, let me see, it's NIH. Right down here. Oh, well, it's in there somewhere, I think. Maybe I have it above it. But you'll see here, each time I go and I try to find, so you'll see sort of the organizations, like there's information about the union. Open jobs. So yeah, here it is. Yeah, so Grant Watch. So that's the organization that's doing it. So if you go to their webpage, so what they're doing is, at least for NIH and NSF, they are collecting a list of all the grants that were terminated. And then they have information on guidance of responding with for an appeal. And then there's another organization. Oh yeah, here it is. The AAUP that I was talking about. They have given guidance for if an NSF grant is terminated. Somebody also told me that the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, is also looking at doing some of this stuff. So the ACLU kind of has money. So I think that they're partnering with an organization which tends not to have a lot of money, like AAUP. And that's where you're starting to see what's happening there. But you see, it says AAU Center for the Defense of Academic Freedom. That seems to be the place where people are centralizing if their grants are terminated.
It looks like we have about 5 minutes left. I'm curious, we've talked about big organizations, we've talked about what different people are doing in different places. I suspect there's a number of people on this webinar right now who are wondering what they can do. Do you have advice for or what we should be preparing for, or etc.?
Yeah, and I hear this question from Emma Rose too, which is basically saying, what should AAAS be doing to push back? And as members of professional societies, what you should be asking them to do. So I think those are two good questions. I want to start with the professional societies, because I've kind of like lost a bit of, as I should say, I've been a member of AAAS for a very long time. I'm actually like a fellow with AAAS, which means I got honored for my abilities and so forth. I go to their annual meeting. I went to the annual meeting this year when all this crisis was occurring, and I cannot tell you how disappointed I was by their sort of actions. And I think that they are now going to just switch to focusing on the budget, which they have done for decades, and not really take account of the times. Now, they are testifying all the time about the importance of scientific research. They're acknowledging the challenges, but I do not see AAAS doing what I think they should do, which is, because they are the biggest organization for all of science, they're not taking legal action. So I think for both AAAS and your professional societies, I think that that, again, I'm basing this off of the New York Times editorial page. They say the same thing in this administration. The only way to push back is through legal action. So what you can do is write to them and then ask them to join these lawsuits. And some of them have, right? I think the American Geophysical Union, for example, I think has been pretty much out there, and they have been doing these things. American Public Health Association, a few of them have, but not all of them. And there's a number of reasons why. Sometimes I think it's just because they don't have the financial resources. Some of these organizations are pretty small, but others of them are not. I should say FASEB. FASEB is another one that is part of this. So Federation, that's the Federation of American Societies in Experimental Biology, who've represented a whole bunch of different organizations. But you'll see in my newsletter, there's them, plus American Society of Cell Biology, so forth. Some of them also are taking actions. So what we have found in these first 100 days is that for federal workers, for everything that's going on, grant termination, so forth, the only way to stop things happening is to file a lawsuit. And what happens is that the lawsuit stops the action. And sometimes people have, like on the federal side, have even gotten their job back. Like this person that I was mentioning before, who's a probation employee who got laid off, like just a few weeks into the job. Well, there was a lawsuit and she got her job back for a couple of months at least. Now she still might lose her job, probably will lose her job, but at least it gives maybe some money to keep you going so you can make a transition, because most of these were absolutely no notice, right? So all of a sudden on a Friday, all these things are happening on Fridays, you get an email Friday at 4:30 p.m., your grant has been rescinded with no details at all, other than it does not follow agency priorities. And again, saying you have no right of appeal, which according to legal scholars is not true. So, so that is to me the most important thing you should do is, ask your professional societies what you're doing, because they'll only do things if their members pressure them. Some places are taking like donations and things like that to kind of help some of these people kind of make the transitions. There, you'll see in my newsletter, there's a few foundations who got together to put together a fund to help with some of the STEM grants that were lost, because at NSF, the ones that are kind of like the EDU things, educational things, the social sciences, that is a part of NSF that got hit the most. And so in some cases, the foundations who support those programs, that's where they're going to redirect some of their funds. Because remember, all these grants have gone through peer review. And as you guys know, the acceptance rate is only like maybe 20-25% for grants submitted to NSF and NIH for most of the agencies. So it's really, really hard to get money. And so for you to lose it is a real challenge. The other place is your local members of Congress, right? So you have seen that there has been, if you're a member of Congress, wherever you live, if they, and by that, I don't mean necessarily where you live for university, but where your home base is, like, if you show up at their town halls, and I mean this for both Democrats and Republicans, because like I said, you're not seeing Democrats do a whole lot either, then you need to go and say, hey, what are you going to do about the defunding of the science technology enterprise, right? Because if nobody protests, if nobody says anything to them, why should they take the risk? Right? That's what you always have to keep in mind. If you won't take the risk, why should they take the risk? So you've seen some very raucous town halls with Republican members of Congress who've had a very hard time. And in fact, I was just watching one of the news programs this morning, they said, well, people are showing up to these town halls that aren't members from our jurisdiction. So one member of Congress carded everybody as they came in. And they found out that everybody who entered were all members of that congressman's district. Okay. So it's really important to reach out to your members of Congress, because again, why should they care if you don't care enough to write a letter, make a phone call, attend one of their meetings? And, even now the Republicans are trying to avoid in-person town meetings because they're getting such bad publicity and just do them all virtual. But, you can still do an awful lot. So anyhow, I guess it's like two fronts I'm basically saying. So for your disciplinary societies, push them to participate in the legal actions that are going out there, because as I say in my newsletter, united we stand, divided we fall. And so no one entity, no one disciplinary society organization can afford it, but together, collectively, we can, and then push back on the policy front, particularly now that the budget is going forward, because that budget affects everybody. That affects the researchers as individuals, the universities, it affects the federal workers. Everybody is affected by that budget.
Debbie, thank you so much. We really, really appreciate it. I've learned an enormous amount, and I suspect many of our participants have as well. We don't have an ability, David, to do a round of applause here, do we?
I don't. I guess people.
Somebody's there. There we go. Look at
Thank
that.
you.
See, people know the technology better than I do.
Well, I will ask. Yeah, I'll ask for those of you who really care about these issues. I encourage you to subscribe to both of my newsletters on LinkedIn. It's free; it doesn't cost anything. But I think that's the best way to keep up with the news, because otherwise you get very piecemeal news.
I've recommended them to a few people, and they've come back to me and say, I can't believe how much amazing information is in there. So Debbie, thank you. That is a service you're doing for all of us. And we know that you're not getting paid for it. You're doing it simply because of your love of, of science and technology in the United States.
Well, and this is just something else for all of you to think about there, where you think, what can I as an individual do to take action? So I'm a solo entrepreneur, right? So what that means is all the time that I take doing these things is just me, right? And so that's part of my resentment, is that, AAAS has a lot of staff, some of them I think could be redirected from where they're taking action now to this activity. Because if I can do something as like one person sitting in my home office space here in Pittsburgh, I think they can do a heck of a lot more in DC. And I think universities who have tremendously big staffs can also do a lot more.
I will just add my thanks as well to both Debbie and to Jamie, and just remind everybody to check out the NNCI website for our next webinar. Nothing planned yet, but I'm sure we'll be having things in the near future.
So bye. Nice meeting everybody.
Thank you, Debbie.